Today, we're going to break down one of the most visionary artworks, inspired by one of the most controversial stories from the Bible, the Book of Job. Welcome to Creative Codex. I am your host, MJDorian. Let's begin. In October, I was given the rare opportunity to view William Blake's art and manuscripts in person at the Morgan Library and Museum here in New York City. At the time, I was working on my 3-part series on the visionary works of William Blake, and I felt this strong desire to view his physical works. There was a sense that I really wouldn't understand his vision until I could see and touch something he made. So, I reached out to the curators of the Morgan Library on the off chance that I would be given permission to view these 2 centuries-old works of genius. And to my complete surprise, my request was granted. I was invited into the Morgan's reading room to view 4 of Blake's works: the illustrations for the Book of Job, the first book of Urizen, the marriage of heaven and hell, and Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. I spent 6 hours there, with these masterpieces at my fingertips, taking it all in, completely in awe. I left with my soul filled and my body exhausted. Today, I want to share with you some of that experience. We're going to explore Blake's visionary interpretation of the Book of Job. The story of Job is a theme that Blake frequently returned to in his artworks throughout his life. He created 2 sets of watercolor paintings, a set of black ink engravings, and multiple individual paintings depicting key moments from the story. It's clear that something in that story spoke to Blake, because there's no other narrative which he dedicates more time and energy to, aside from his own original mythology. So what does the Book of Job mean to Blake? Let's find out. Most of this video will be about the first watercolor set that Blake made for Job, which was commissioned by one of his patrons named Thomas Butts in 1805. This is commonly known as the Butts set. Yes, I know, it's hard to stay serious about something called the Butts set, but we're going to take a crack at it. This is the one I viewed at the Morgan. There is a second set commissioned by another patron named John Linnell, 16 years later in 1821. But I think the earlier one is far superior. Butts is the best, you know. I know some scholars prefer Linnell, but I'm a Butts man. What can I say? And as we explore the work, I'm sure you'll agree. Throughout the video, we will sometimes compare the Butts set illustrations to some paintings which Blake made on the same scenes outside of this collection. Again, the story of Job clearly resonated with him. So as we make our way through all 21 artworks, we'll explore the story itself and quote key passages, all to better understand the value that Blake saw in it. The story of the Book of Job begins. In the land of Uz, spelled U-Z, there is a blameless and upright man named Job, who, we are told, fears God and avoids evil. He has a loving wife, 7 sons, and 3 daughters. Job is very wealthy. We should remember this is by the standards of 2,600 years ago. The Bible describes him as having a tremendous amount of work animals, including 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. Job is well loved and respected. He is a charitable man and follows through on all his religious duties too, giving burnt offerings to God every morning for each of his sons. The Bible quotes Job as saying, It may be that my sons have sinned and blasphemed God in their hearts." Unquote. In the artwork, we see Blake setting the stage for the story. He shows the distant city, the land of Uz. There's musical instruments in the tree above them, perhaps implying harmony and abundance. Job and his large, healthy family are positioned perfectly between the sun and moon. It's unclear whether we are witnessing nightfall or daybreak, but if we consider the terrors which are about to befall Job, then I'm inclined to believe this is nightfall. Blake is foreshadowing something. The sun is setting in the symbolic west, and the crescent moon is on the rise from the east. Although many days will pass in the length of the narrative, the rest of the scenes will take place in a proverbial darkness. Blake has written text on the sun which states, "Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy will, ... The rest disappears behind the mountain." Finally, notice the gentle demeanor which Blake has taken great pains to convey. From Job's upward glancing eyes, to his wife's submitting face, to all of his children kneeling in obedience and prayer. The second illustration shows Satan appearing before God on a cloud of flames. God says, "Whence came you?" And Satan responds, "From roaming the earth and patrolling it." God says, "Have you noticed my servant Job, and that there is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright, fearing God and avoiding evil?" Satan retorts, "Is it for nothing that Job is God-fearing? Have you not surrounded him and his family and all that he has with your protection? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his livestock are spread over the land. But now put forth your hand and touch anything that he has, and surely he will blaspheme you to your face." The Lord responds, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand upon his person." It's unclear in the text if God is insulted or curious by Satan's challenge. His motivation in knowingly inviting suffering upon Job is never made clear, and this becomes the mystery of the entire tale. What is God's motivation? It can't simply be pride, can it? In the artwork, notice the incredible grace with which Blake renders the angelic figures. They float around and actually give the appearance of weightlessness. We should take note of how God looks in this image. He has a book on his lap, perhaps a book of laws of the universe. His right hand is pointing downward, and his right foot emerges from under his robe. A direct comparison can be made to the way Blake represents his mythological god Urizen in his engravings for his book, The First Book of Urizen. Look at the title page. These two artworks are roughly 10 years apart, but knowing Blake, this similarity is intentional. Lastly, look at the bottom of the artwork. We see a more tranquil setting, showing Job seated with his family. Notice the eye lines of each person. Job's wife gazes down at the book in his lap, Job's children all gaze at him, and Job is gazing up at the two angels, who have seemingly come with messages. Are they warning him of what is to come? Or does Blake want us to see that Job was a deeply spiritual man, even communing with angels, while his family were more connected to the material plane? This particular detail is not implied anywhere in the biblical text. So why does Blake include it? We know that Blake often admitted to friends or patrons that he had visions of angels throughout his life. They started when he was a young child. This was so commonplace for Blake that he would often mention it in the same way one mentions going to the supermarket. Let's bring our attention to the third illustration. Satan begins Job's first trial with the intent to prove to God that Job's faith is merely dependent on material comforts and the well-being of loved ones. He arrives at a large banquet at the home of Job's eldest son, where all of Job's children are eating and drinking together. Satan summons a mighty wind that rattles the structure. The columns crumble and the roof falls on everyone inside. the disaster results in the death of all of Job's children. Notice the incredible expressiveness in the faces Blake draws. When I saw this work in person at the Morgan, I couldn't help but marvel at how small these figures are on the page, and yet how perfectly Blake has rendered them. Each one of these heads is less than a square inch in size, and yet they all express some distinctive emotion, a mixture of panic, fear, and terror. Some of the contour lines that form the bodies are thinner than a hair. For example, the delicate lines expressing Satan's muscular arm give the impression that the ink was just effortlessly applied. By this point of his life, in his late 40s, Blake was a master of his art form. He was using all the tools at his disposal to translate his inspiration to the paper. Lastly, Satan's face is so perfect. He has this look on his face which can only be described as sinister. The fourth illustration depicts Job being informed of the disaster which has taken place at the banquet. There is alarm, panic, and shock drawn on these poses and faces. All of Job's children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, are dead. We see in the distance a boy running, likely to inform Job of the other losses on his property which have just occurred. All of his thousands of livestock have variously been stolen or killed by lightning. Overcome by these tragedies, Job falls to his knees and calls out, "Naked I came forth from my mother's womb, and naked shall I go back again. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Satan returns to God, and God says, "Have you noticed my servant Job, and that there is no one on earth like him, faultless and upright, fearing God and avoiding evil? He still holds fast to his innocence, although you incited me against him, to ruin him without cause." Satan responds, "Skin for skin, all that a man has he will give for his life. But now put forth your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and surely he will blaspheme you to your face." God takes the bait and lets this experiment continue, saying, "He is in your power, only spare his life." In Blake's illustration of this scene, we see the moment right after God has given this permission to Satan, and the Dark One, on a cloud of flames, falls back toward the earth to accost Job directly. At the bottom of the artwork, we see Job, despite all that has happened, displaying acts of charity. He is giving a crippled blind man bread. Thus begins the second trial of Job before God and Satan. The dramatic sixth illustration shows Satan pouring some evil concoction on the reclining Job with his left hand, and inviting down piercing arrows with his right hand from the heavens. Blake has represented Job throwing his head backward and with his body stiff as if seized by a sudden pain. If we look closely at the muscular form of Satan, we can see Blake has delicately drawn scales on his bluish skin. In the aftermath, Job is covered with severe boils, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job's wife pleads with him, saying he must have done some grave sin. He cannot be innocent. In her words, she tells him, "Curse God and die." Job is suffering tremendously, but does not waver from his faith. He states, "We accept good things from God, and should we not accept evil?" This is a heavy phrase from Job, the implication being that God is not all good. It reminds me of people who say, God is good, but what would Job say in his state? Shortly after, 3 of Job's friends arrive. He is so covered in boils, they don't recognize him. Out of respect for his suffering, they sit in silence with him for 7 days and 7 nights. Blake's technique with these illustrations is now becoming clear. We can trace the steps he takes with each one based on the recurring elements of each artwork. He starts each page with a pencil sketch, then does the contour lines and faces with black ink using an extra fine quill. Next, he adds a gray watercolor wash to define the shadows in the environment and the form of each figure. And finally, he adds hues with watercolors. This is a very unique style, especially the use of this gray wash as a base. It gives the figures a statue-like quality. In the 8th illustration, Job stretches up his arms and voices his despair, as his wife and 3 friends prostrate themselves out of respect and prayer. Job curses the day he was born. He says, "Perish the day on which I was born, the night when they said, 'The child is a boy.' May that day be darkness. Let not God above call for it, nor light shine upon it." In verse 3:11, he continues, "Why did I not perish at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Or why was I not buried away like an untimely birth, like babies that have never seen the light? Wherefore did the knees receive me? Or why did I suck at the breasts? For then I should have lain down and been tranquil. Had I slept, I should then have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth, who built where now there are ruins, or with princes who had gold and filled their houses with silver. There the wicked cease from troubling, there the weary are at rest. There the captives are at ease together, and hear not the voice of the slave driver. Small and great are there the same, and the servant is free from his master." Unquote. Anyone who has experienced losing someone whom they deeply love knows the level of grief which Job is expressing. We should remember that regardless of the physical maladies and loss of wealth, Job just lost all 10 of his children. And I imagine that in his position, if his culture did not see taking your own life as a sin, he would take that path. Job states, "Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would grant what I long for. Even that God would decide to crush me, that he would put forth his hand and cut me off." What follows in the text after this are several monologues by the 3 friends, each with a responding monologue from Job. These are speeches given by Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. The scene Blake's 9th illustration depicts is a vision told by Eliphaz. In verse 4:12, Eliphaz states, "For a word was stealthily brought to me, and my ear caught a whisper of it. In my thoughts during visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear came upon me, and shuddering, that terrified me to the bones. Then a spirit passed over me, and the hair of my flesh stood up. It paused, but its likeness I could not discern. A figure was before my eyes, and I heard a still voice. Can a mortal man be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker?" Unquote. Eliphaz continues his speech and argues that God punishes the wicked and that the faithful are always in his care, saying things like, "Happy is the man whom God reproves. The Almighty's chastening do not reject, for he wounds, but he binds up. He smites, but his hands give healing." Unquote. Although this sounds like a good argument at first, it has the opposite effect on Job. He argues back that clearly no one understands the depths of his suffering, and that he does not deserve these punishments because he has not sinned. In verse 6:2, Job says, "Ah, could my anguish but be measured, and my calamity laid with it in the scales, they should outweigh the sands of the sea. Because of this I speak without restraint. For the arrows of the Almighty pierce me, and my spirits drink in their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me." In verse 6:24, he states, "Teach me, and I will be silent. Prove to me where I have erred. How agreeable are honest words, yet how unconvincing is your argument." Unquote. This rebuttal is then answered by the second friend, Bildad, and this pattern of dialogue continues. Job replies with a monologue, disagreeing with one of his friend's statements about the nature of God, and the next friend makes a new argument. This happens in 3 cycles. Each friend gives 3 monologues, and Job responds to each monologue. This takes up most of the text of the book of Job. Ultimately, Job does not agree with the statements of his friends, or he feels they aren't acknowledging the gross injustice of the punishments leveled on him. And this is what is just beautifully depicted by Blake in the 10th illustration. Job is looking up to the heavens pleadingly, but also defiantly. His muscular frame has risen up, and he bares his arms and chest. Job's 3 friends point all of their hands at him in accusation, continually implying that if he or his children had not sinned, then he would have been spared. Even Job's wife seems to be saying, "What the hell, man? What did you do, Job?" The way Blake renders the hands in this illustration is just masterful. Each hand is expressing a distinct emotion. Look at Job's wife's hands, then Job's hands, and then the group of friends' hands. Also, in admiring this artwork in person, I noticed that this was one of the few that Blake signed, W.B. The only other illustrations from the set he has signed so far are 5 and this one, which is 10. Let's keep that in mind moving forward, as I think his signature tells us he is particularly proud of that artwork. In one of Job's rebuttals, he utters this line from verse 9:22. "It is all one. Therefore I say, both the innocent and the wicked he destroys. When the scourge slays suddenly, he laughs at the despair of the innocent. The earth is given into the hands of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not he, who then is it?" In another response, verse 21:7, Job again challenges the notion that God is only good by pointing to the injustices of the world. "Why do the wicked survive, grow old, become mighty in power? Their progeny is secure in their sight. They see before them their kinsfolk and their offspring. Their homes are safe and without fear, nor is the scourge of God upon them. Their bulls gender without fail, their cows calve, and do not miscarry. These folks have infants numerous as lambs, and their children dance. They sing to the timbrel and harp, and make merry to the sound of the flute. They live out their days in prosperity, and tranquilly go down to the nether world. Yet they say to God, 'Depart from us, for we have no wish to learn your ways.'" The next illustration has to be my absolute favorite. This is visionary, and this is thoroughly Blake. You won't see any other artists creating something like this. I would say that creating the entire set of Job watercolors was worth it for this one image. This is based on verse 7:13, spoken by Job, which says, "When I say, 'My bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint,' then you affright me with dreams and with visions, terrify me, so that I should prefer choking and death rather than my pains." Unquote. In Blake's rendition of this verse, we see Job plagued by terrifying visions in his sleep. In this one, either God is transformed into Satan, or Satan is transformed into God. Perhaps we are seeing some union of the two. This God figure has the long white hair and beard of God the Father, but appears to also have hooves for feet, and a rainbow serpent wraps around his outstretched form. With his right arm, he points to the 10 Commandments written in Hebrew, and with his left, he encloses the space around Job's head and points downward to the hellish flames under Job's bed, from which demons spring up and try to restrain him. They appear to be transparent, ghostly, like apparitions, as we see the contour of the bed throughout their bodies. Job is struggling, still covered in boils, while a few inches from him, This God figure has a sublime expression on his face. It's such a powerful and intense image. As I admired this artwork, I noticed the Hebrew characters on the tablet above and couldn't help but wonder what they meant. So I phoned a friend who is knowledgeable on Hebrew. He told me this was the commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." That provided another interesting layer to this artwork. I have to wonder if perhaps Blake had this kind of nightmare vision at some point, and that is why he chose these details for the artwork, because none of this is mentioned anywhere in the book of Job, aside from the line about being plagued by visions at night. And, look at that, Blake signed this one too. After the dialogue between Job and his three friends has finished, a fourth speaker appears, a young man named Elihu, who admits that he waited to come forward and speak, out of respect for his elders. Elihu offers up the best argument against Job's statements. He is angry with Job for considering himself rather than God to be in the right. Blake illustrates this exchange in the 12th illustration. Elihu states that Job is wrong in saying God does not give account of his doings and does not reply to man's questions. He makes a bold claim in verse 33:13 that God speaks to man in dreams, stating, "Why, then, do you make a complaint against him, that he gives no account of his doings? For God does speak, perhaps once or even twice, though one perceive it not, in the dream, in the vision of the night, when deep sleep falls upon men as they slumber in their beds. It is then he opens the ears of men, and as a warning to them, terrifies them." Unquote. Elihu then gives credit to God for both the miraculous workings of nature and the disasters of weather, such as the tempest and the frost. Earlier, in verse 23:8, Job questioned God's absence. "But if I go to the east, he is not there, or to the west, I cannot perceive him. Where the north enfolds him, I behold him not. By the south he is veiled, and I see him not. Yet he knows my way. If he proved me, I should come forth as gold. My foot has always walked in his steps. His way I have kept and have not turned aside." Unquote. And in verse 13:3, Job states, "But I would speak with the Almighty. I wish to reason with God." Unquote. Well, finally, it seems like he gets his wish. In the 13th illustration, God appears to Job through a whirlwind to speak to him directly. In verse 38:1, God says, "Who is this that obscures divine plans with words of ignorance? Gird up your loins now, like a man. I will question you, and you tell me the answers. Where were you when I founded the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its size? Do you know? Who stretched out the measuring line for it? Into what were its pedestals sunk, and who laid the cornerstone? While the morning stars sang in chorus, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Unquote. God starts his argument by effectively putting Job in his place. How can Job even think to question God's judgment? Was he present at the creation of the earth? Tone comes across as a strange mixture of both profound reflection and disgruntled dad energy. The Bible's description of God's physical appearance to Job leaves much to the imagination. Less than a full sentence refers to God appearing in a storm or whirlwind, but this vagueness is a perfect opportunity for a great artist like Blake to fill in the blanks for us. Blake was so inspired by this scene that he created a second, separate painting of it in 1805. God is seen with his arms outstretched in what appears to be a whirlwind of angels. It's such a visionary image. I think it's among Blake's greatest artistic achievements. It should be considered among the greatest depictions of divinity, somehow in its directness, even more evocative than the Sistine Chapel. In verse 38:41, God demands, "Who provides nourishment for the ravens when their young ones cry out to God, and they rove abroad without food?" God is a bit ticked off to have his judgment questioned by Job. He lists all the myriad forces of nature which he oversees, effectively saying, "How dare you? Don't you know how busy I am?" But all kidding aside, perhaps the intended message is, there are things beyond which you can comprehend. What you see as chaos is ruled by a secret order. Blake uses this lengthy passage of God's monologue as inspiration for two of the following illustrations. Number 14 depicts God as the ruling master of the universe. The angels and star above sing his glory, while the sun and moon, on his right and left, move according to his laws. The sun is accompanied by 4 steeds, and the moon holds the reins of 2 serpents. These creatures call to mind the serpent that was wrapping around the God figure in illustration 11, which shows the nightmare vision. The verses that seem to inspire Blake in this rendition of God as master of the universe are 38:7 and 38:31, in which God challenges Job by asking him what he knows of the workings of the universe, asking, "Where were you when I founded the earth, while the morning stars sang in chorus, and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" And in 38:31, stating, "Can thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion?" In illustration 15, we see God showing Job some of his more monstrous creations, creatures of mythic proportion that exist outside the realm of material reality, the behemoth and Leviathan. God speaks at length about these in verses 40:15 and 41:26. He begins by stating, "See, beside you I made Behemoth, that feeds on grass like an ox. Behold the strength in his loins, and his vigor in the sinews of his belly. He came at the beginning of God's ways, and was made the taskmaster of his fellows." Unquote. And beginning the next passage, stating, "Can you lead about Leviathan with a hook, or curb his tongue with a bit? Can you put a rope into his nose, or pierce through his cheek with a gaff? Will he make an agreement with you that you may have him as a slave forever? Can you play with him as with a bird?" Unquote. Again, Blake rises to the occasion with this illustration. It is unlike anything artists in the 1800s or earlier were creating. It stands out as a stunning and visionary work. The 16th illustration in Blake's series is noteworthy for entirely different reasons. In it, Blake depicts the fall of Satan as he is being cast down from his role as one of God's angels and sent into the fires of the underworld. The depiction of Satan and what appear to be a male and female figure on his left and right is so intense and dramatic, as they seem to be cast down by God through a force of lightning. But as a companion piece to the story of Job, it is unexpected. Nowhere in the book of Job does God mention casting Satan down or punishing him for challenging him with the Job experiment. Although visually it feels part of the set of 21 watercolors, it is not literally in the text. One assumption we can make is perhaps that Blake's patron, Thomas Butts, requested such a scene to be included in Blake's renditions of the story. Or perhaps Blake wanted to create such a rendition as he felt it completed the book of Job more as a narrative, because after the introduction, there is no mention again of Satan or what happens to him, or if God even takes any issue with Satan's challenge. And the same can be said for the illustration that follows this one. Number 17 is titled The Vision of Christ by Blake scholars, although it could just as well be depicting God the Father, as he assumes this appearance throughout the collection. It seems to imply some kind of redemption of Job, as he and his wife are kneeling and receiving a blessing. You can see that Job has been finally cured of his boils as well. Such a moment is never mentioned in the book of Job, so it was again either requested by Blake's patron, or he felt it necessary to include it to flesh out the narrative. Though the slight alterations in the style and colors of the image implied that it was completed at a later date, and not during the bulk of the illustrations of the set. In verse 42, Job responds to God, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be hindered. I have dealt with great things that I do not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I cannot know. I had heard of you by word of mouth, but now my eye has seen you. Therefore, I disown what I have said, and repent in dust and ashes." God forgives Job, but surprisingly, he doesn't forgive Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and the young Elihu who speaks after them is not even acknowledged at this point. God is angry with the three older friends because they have not spoken rightly concerning him. God says they misrepresented him and that Job spoke rightly. He says that to make amends, the friends need to bring 7 bullocks and 7 rams to Job, and that Job should offer them up as a burnt offering and pray for them. God will only accept Job's prayer for the forgiveness of his friends and, in his words, will not punish them severely. This burnt offering is what Blake depicts in the 18th illustration. God restores all that was lost to Job. He has a family back, 7 sons and 3 daughters, although whether they are the same sons and daughters is not mentioned. That would kind of be inconsiderate of God to let Satan kill Job's children and then give him all new kids. In addition, God gives Job double all the various livestock he had previously, and everyone in the land of Uz comes to Job's home and gives him a piece of money. The 20th illustration depicts Job with his 3 daughters. In having appreciated all of these artworks in person, I can say that the quality of this one is not the same as the others in the series. It gives the impression that it was completed years later, in some way removed from the fires of inspiration that bore the entire collection into form. The figures are a bit odd in proportion, which is uncharacteristic of Blake, who displays a mastery of anatomy throughout the other illustrations. The hands are also not rendered with the grace and precision we saw earlier. The prevailing theory is that Blake painted this illustration years later when he was commissioned by John Linnell, but it almost feels like a different artist. If Blake had an apprentice, I would say this could be credited to them. Perhaps we can instead say he was having an off day, or was under the weather, or perhaps rushed this piece. There is something reassuring in the idea that even visionary geniuses have an off day here or there. But whatever grace this rendition lacks, Blake more than makes up for it with a standalone painting he creates of the same theme, Job and his daughters. This one is done with tempera paint rather than graphite and watercolor washes. There's something beyond words being conveyed here, as with all great works of art, something hard to pin down, whether that's the mood, the lighting combined with the strong composition, or even the cracking paint. It speaks to you. It is more than just a painting. This is the Blake we know and love. The final illustration in this series is the triumphant end of the story of Job. It is rendered with great care by Blake, overflowing with detail. We see the 7 sons of Job, 4 on the left and 3 on the right. The 3 daughters, again flanking him left, right, and center. Everyone has picked up an instrument, some even 2. This illustration forms a bookend with the first illustration of the series. If you look at them side by side, they can be seen as a deliberate pair. And notice the placement of the sun and moon. They have flipped their position. In Blake's trademark thoughtfulness, he has considered how the artworks shape the narrative. He used the sun descending in the western side of the artwork to denote the coming of a proverbial darkness, and now the sun is rising in the east, symbolizing a return to the light, a time of renewal and harmony, further emphasized by the music the family plays together. So what does the Book of Job really teach us? And why was it meaningful to William Blake? First, there's no doubt that Blake felt an affinity for the figure of Job. He felt a certain resentment at the world throughout his life for not being recognized, for living in poverty while his friends who made more commercial art succeeded. He resonated with the sense of injustice that Job expresses as he yells to the heavens. There is also another aspect of the story which I think attracted Blake's attention. Throughout his monologues, Job overtly states that God can cause both good and evil, that he is the source that both giveth and taketh away. As he says to his wife after being covered in boils, "We accept good things from God, and should we not accept evil?" We're so accustomed to hearing the modern Christian conception of God as this all-loving figure. But in the Book of Job, this story from 600 years before Christ, we see a very different God. When they finally meet face to face, God is upset with Job, but not for his statements regarding this dual nature of God to cause both good and evil, but rather for Job's presumptuousness to question God's judgment. His main qualms are that Job has the audacity to question his actions and decisions. Job was right. The three friends who God chastises spoke all the regular platitudes we continue to hear religious people speak today. This God of the Old Testament, which is represented in the Book of Job, is more of a raw force of nature. He even appears to Job in a tempest. This God is much more in line with native pagan traditions than modern Christian ones. It is almost like the friends argue for God's capacities to dole out justice and to be an interventionist God on the side of good. And then God comes along and says, "No, actually, Job was right. I can do evil stuff too." In this regard, Blake saw the Old Testament God as a demiurge type figure, and he equated him to a fallen god of his own invention, named Urizen. If you'd like to hear more about Blake's gods and mythology, be sure to check out my podcast of the same name, Creative Codex. That's CODEX. Episode 49 dives deep into Blake's mythos. Just search for it on Spotify or your preferred podcast app. There's also a link in this video's description. In closing, should we take this as a literal story about the nature of God? It's tempting, and I think critics of Abrahamic religions do choose to take it literally. But should we? No, I don't think so. I think it's an allegory, and I think that's how Blake saw it too. It is an allegorical tale that uses the characters of God, Satan, and Job to illustrate what true connection to the divine looks like. It is unshakable and not dependent on material reality. Looking at it as an allegory, we can see that the story of Job also tells us that suffering does sometimes visit those who are most virtuous and least deserving of punishment. That misfortune sometimes falls on those who are already unfortunate. And if we view God not as a human-like figure, but as the entire universe itself, well then, this all adds up. William Blake once wrote, "Allegory addressed to the intellectual powers, while it is altogether hidden from the corporeal understanding, is my definition of the most sublime poetry." Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out the Creative Codex podcast, where we've completed a 3-part series all about William Blake's work on episodes 47 through 49. And if you'd like to help support the show and see more videos like this one, please consider joining my Patreon at patreon.com/MJDorian. That's patreon.com/MJDorian. And thank you in advance for your support.